Mike Hawthorne had seen his fair share of oddities during his years as a long-haul trucker, but the night he picked up the hitchhiker on Route 66 was something he'd never be able to forget. It was the dead of summer, but the air on that stretch of highway felt cold, almost unnatural. The only sound was the rumble of the truck's engine and the low hum of the tires against the asphalt. The night was as still as a cemetery, and the stars above looked like distant eyes watching him. Mike had seen this part of the road 1,000 times before, but tonight something felt different, wrong even. He could feel the oppressive silence pressing in on him, a silence that felt like it was alive. Around 2 a.m., in the middle of nowhere, he saw a figure standing by the roadside. A man wrapped in a thick jacket despite the oppressive summer heat, his thumb raised in that universal gesture of a hitchhiker. Mike had learned to ignore such things over the years, but tonight something about the man made him hesitate. "Come on, Mike," he muttered to himself, gripping the wheel. "You're not some dumb kid anymore." But despite his better judgment, Mike's foot eased off the gas pedal and he pulled the truck to the side of the road, his headlights cutting through the darkness. The hitchhiker approached the truck slowly, his steps heavy, deliberate. Mike's gut twisted. He couldn't place it. But there was something wrong about this guy. His eyes were too dark, too hollow. They were the kind of eyes you only see on the dead. The man didn't speak a word as he climbed into the passenger seat. Mike shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't say anything. He couldn't quite bring himself to speak. There was a chill in the air now, one that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He could feel the man's presence, but there was no sound, no rustling of clothes, no breath. It was as though he wasn't really there at all. After what felt like hours of silence, Mike couldn't take it anymore. He glanced over at the hitchhiker, his mouth dry, and asked, "Where are you headed?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised a bony finger and pointed out the windshield, far into the distance. Mike followed the direction of the finger, his eyes straining in the dark, until they fixed on an old abandoned building on the horizon. Its silhouette loomed against the night sky, a decaying shell of a place that shouldn't have been standing at all. Mike's heart began to race. "Where?" he whispered under his breath, though he didn't know why. He had a feeling, a deep sense that this place, this building, held some kind of significance. But when he looked back to his passenger, the hitchhiker was gone. The seat next to him was empty. His pulse quickened, and Mike slammed his foot on the brake, pulling over to the side of the road again. He twisted his head frantically, but there was no sign of the man. The air was thick with silence, so thick that it pressed against his eardrums. He turned his head slowly, the hairs on his neck prickling with the weight of something. Something wrong. He caught his breath and looked into the rearview mirror. Nothing. No one. His hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, and his heart pounded in his chest like a drum. That hollow-eyed gaze seemed to pierce through him even now. The hitchhiker hadn't just disappeared, he had vanished. Mike's mind raced as he tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was exhaustion playing tricks on him. Maybe it was the isolation of the road, the endless blackness making him imagine things. But deep down, he knew better. He had felt it. Something unexplainable. Something that wasn't natural. The next day, Mike couldn't shake the feeling. He had to know more about that building, the one the hitchhiker had pointed to. So after dropping off his load, he made his way back, hoping to find some sort of clue. He didn't know why, but something told him he needed to. When he reached the building, his breath caught in his throat. It was exactly as it had looked in the dark, abandoned, crumbling, and eerily quiet. There was a plaque on the front, barely legible, but Mike made it out. Site of the 1982 Highway 66 crash, in memory of the lost souls. His blood ran cold. The details were fuzzy, but Mike recalled hearing about a tragic accident many years ago. A crash that had killed several people in the dead of night on that stretch of highway. The name of the hitchhiker came back to him then, a name that had been whispered in stories about the accident. Jared Stevens, a young man who had died in that very building when his truck swerved off the road and collided with a brick wall. Mike turned away from the plaque, his legs weak. He had picked up a ghost, a soul lost to the road, a soul that had pointed him toward his final resting place. He never drove that route again. And every time he thought of that night, the hollow eyes of the hitchhiker haunted him just beyond the darkness, waiting for the next soul to pass by. Jerry Donovan had been on the road for over 10 hours when the fatigue set in. The open highway stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through the backwoods of Maine. The cab of his rig felt like a lonely prison, the hum of the engine the only sound for miles around. He'd been hauling freight for years, and after a decade of road work, he'd become immune to the loneliness. Or so he thought. The small, rural town he'd passed a few miles back seemed like a good place to take a break, so Jerry pulled into a diner on the outskirts of nowhere. The neon sign flickered above him, casting an eerie glow on the cracked pavement. Inside, the diner was almost deserted. Just a few truckers slouched over their mugs of coffee. Jerry ordered a greasy burger and fries, then sat by the window watching the rain begin to pour. He could feel the weight of the road in his bones, and the peace of the moment was something he hadn't realized he needed. But when he finished his meal and climbed back into the rig, the feeling hit him. That strange sensation of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. Jerry chalked it up to his exhaustion, nothing more than his mind playing tricks on him. He started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, the truck rumbling to life under his hands. But the feeling wouldn't go away. At first, it was just a subtle disturbance, shadows moving in his peripheral vision, flickers of movement that he couldn't explain. His gaze snapped to the side, but there was nothing. Nothing but the dark highway stretching out into the rain. He checked the mirrors. The passenger seat was empty. Jerry wiped his brow, the sweat mixing with the chill of the rain-slicked air. He turned on the lights, peering through the windshield at the dark expanse ahead. The road was deserted, as it had been for hours, but every so often in the corner of his vision, there was something, a shifting shape, a vague silhouette that seemed to move just out of the light. He could feel its presence, like a cold breath on the back of his neck. He shook his head, tried to shake the unease out of his mind. "You're just tired," he muttered aloud. "You've been on the road too long. It's nothing." But the unsettling sensation didn't fade. It clung to him like a shadow, always there, always just beyond the reach of the light. He reached over to adjust the radio, trying to drown out the feeling with static, but the presence in the cab only grew stronger. He glanced in the rearview mirror again, eyes wide and searching. His hands tightened on the wheel. Nothing. Nothing but the empty highway. His eyes darted to the passenger seat. It was still empty. But in that brief moment, when his gaze lingered, something shifted. A shadow moved. Just a flicker, a blur. He snapped his eyes away, heart pounding. It had to be his imagination. It had to be. But the feeling lingered, heavy and oppressive, pressing in on him from every direction. It wasn't until he reached the next rest stop that he saw it. Jerry pulled into the lot, the truck's brakes screeching slightly as he parked. He sat there for a moment, his fingers still clutching the wheel. The night was quiet, save for the distant sound of rain drumming on the roof. He reached over to the passenger seat, intending to grab his jacket from the spot he always left it. But when his hand brushed the leather, something stopped him. A cold, damp handprint. The fingers were splayed, pressed against the fabric of the seat like a warning. It was unmistakable. Wet, streaked with something that felt unnatural, like the touch of ice. Jerry recoiled, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't seen anyone get in, hadn't heard anything. He had been alone. And yet that handprint, vivid, clear, was there. The seat was empty, but something had been sitting there. Something that left its mark. Something that had been riding with him, unnoticed, through the night. Jerry's heart thudded in his chest, the blood rushing to his head. He grabbed the door handle, pulled it open, and jumped out of the truck, his boots slapping against the wet pavement. He walked around the cab, his hands shaking, looking for some sign, any sign, that would explain what had just happened. But the more he looked, the more he realized that there was no logical explanation. No footprints in the rain. Just the handprint, cold and damp, as if someone or something had been sitting beside him the entire time. He climbed back into the truck, trembling, his mind racing with all the possibilities. He glanced at the mirrors again. The rain had slowed, but the road was still empty. The rest stopped quiet as ever. The feeling didn't go away. The presence, the cold, invisible passenger, it was still there, waiting, watching. And as Jerry drove away into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had ridden with him, whatever had left that handprint, wasn't done with him yet. It was still out there, and it would be waiting for him when he stopped again. It was well past midnight when Lisa pulled her rig into the small, isolated truck stop. The neon sign above the convenience store buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the empty parking lot. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and wet pavement, and a heavy silence hung over the place, as if the world outside had forgotten it even existed. Lisa had been driving for hours and she was exhausted. The road had been deserted for miles, the blacktop stretching on endlessly, and she needed rest, needed to get off the highway for a while. She parked her truck in the far corner of the lot, away from the few other rigs that were scattered around. It wasn't that she minded the solitude. She'd been on the road long enough to become used to it, but there was something about this truck stop that felt off. Maybe it was the emptiness of the place, the way the lights flickered in the store window, or the eerie quiet that seemed to hang over the lot like a fog. But she shook it off. She'd been driving too long, and her body was screaming for a break. Inside the convenience store, the fluorescent lights flickered as Lisa made her way to the counter, grabbing a bottle of water and a bag of chips. As she paid, her eyes caught a man sitting in the far corner, his figure half shrouded in shadow. He was staring at her with unnerving intensity, his cold, calculating eyes never leaving her face. He wasn't looking at her like someone admiring a woman's beauty or even someone lost in thought. No, his gaze was sharp, predatory, like he was studying her, waiting for something. The hairs on the back of Lisa's neck stood up. She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening, but she brushed it off as paranoia. She'd been on the road for too long, and fatigue had started to warp her perception. This was nothing. He was just another trucker, probably as tired and worn as she was. She grabbed her things and left, her steps quick and purposeful as she headed back to her truck. The stillness of the parking lot was even more pronounced now that the store door had shut behind her. Lisa could hear the distant hum of her truck's engine as she climbed back into the cab, locking the door behind her. The truck's cabin was familiar, her haven, but even in here, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She tried to push the thought away, but it clung to her like the humidity in the air. She stretched out in the seat, her eyes heavy, but sleep wouldn't come. The thought of the man, his gaze, kept flashing in her mind. She turned on the radio, trying to drown out the unease creeping up her spine, but it did little to soothe her. Then hours later, she woke up to a sound, soft, slow, deliberate. The creak of footsteps on the asphalt outside her truck. Lisa's heart leapt into her throat. She froze, her ears straining in the darkness. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of someone walking around her rig. The sound was too close, too deliberate. Someone was out there. Terror crawled through her veins as she slowly pulled herself up in the seat, her hands shaking. The footsteps stopped. A suffocating silence followed, and for a moment, Lisa thought she might be imagining it. Then she heard a soft scraping sound, a metal on metal, like the sharp edge of something dragging across the concrete. Her breath hitched as she leaned toward the window, her heart hammering in her chest. Peering out, she barely dared to breathe. Through the darkness, she saw the figure, the same man from the store, standing next to her truck. This time he was closer, his silhouette barely visible under the pale moonlight. But what really sent her pulse racing was the glint of steel in his hand, a knife. Lisa's mind raced, panic rising in her throat like bile. Her instincts kicked in before her brain could catch up. She yanked the keys from the ignition and started the engine in a panic, her fingers fumbling with the gear shift as she slammed it into reverse. The truck lurched backward, tires screeching against the wet pavement, and she slammed her foot on the gas. Behind her, she could hear the man's footsteps, slow, heavy, deliberate, as he followed her truck. She didn't dare look back, didn't dare take her eyes off the road as she sped out of the parking lot, her tires tearing up the gravel as she floored it. The sound of her engine drowned out the noise behind her, but the image of the man's face, cold and emotionless, stayed burned in her mind. She didn't stop driving until she reached the next town, where she pulled into a well-lit truck stop. Only then did she allow herself to breathe again, her hands shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. Her heart was still racing, and the adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her exhausted and shaken. The next morning, Lisa went to the truck stop's office to report the incident. The man had been watching her every move, she was sure of it. But when she mentioned the strange occurrence to the clerk, the look on his face changed. He wasn't surprised. In fact, he almost seemed relieved. "You're not the first," he said, his voice low. "There have been others. Strange things happen here sometimes. People see things, hear things. It's not just you, miss. Something about this place. It draws them in." Lisa frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" The clerk didn't answer right away. He simply glanced over his shoulder, his eyes darting nervously to the parking lot outside. "Let's just say this place has a history. A lot of truckers, well, they've disappeared. No one knows where they go or what happens to them, but they don't come back." Lisa's blood ran cold. She didn't need any more details. She'd experienced enough to know that some places weren't meant to be trusted, and this truck stop with its flickering lights and empty lot was one of them. As she climbed back into her truck, she cast one last glance at the parking lot. The man wasn't there, but something told her he wasn't far, just waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to drive into that quiet, lonely place. And this time, Lisa knew she wouldn't be the last.